Al Jazeera podcasts.
Today, Trump's epic climb down on Greenland as he reaches a framework with NATO.
Donald Trump says he and the head of NATO have agreed to the framework of a future deal with respect to Greenland.
What is it like for Greenlanders to see their future decided from thousands of kilometers away? I'm Kevin Hirten, and this is The Take. As you're watching today's show, remember to leave us a comment telling us what you think about this episode. We really do read them. There's some great comments, like we got one on our previous Greenland episode from Saeed Dadashti. He said, "Greetings from Iran. Thank you for making this rich and eye-opening podcast. I had very little knowledge of Greenland. Shamefully, I didn't even know it had its own name. Khalid knew not. That's what you learn from watching The Take."
My name is Jonah Hull. I'm a correspondent, of course, with Al Jazeera English News. You catch me here in Greenland, in the capital Nuuk, where I've been for a few days, covering the story as Donald Trump appears to, endlessly heighten his rhetoric about wanting to take over this island by force or other means, and then suddenly changed his mind addressing delegates in Davos. So a rocky period on a huge and rocky island in the Arctic.
Hey, so Jonah, welcome to The Take. So after months of putting this enormous pressure on Europe, President Trump is now saying that he has a framework of a Greenland deal with NATO. And crucially, that he's backing off his threat to impose these new tariffs and the threat of possibly taking Greenland by force. Wild times, as you said. What do we actually know about this framework so far?
Well, I think it's fair to say there's an awful lot we don't know, and not very much that we do. Donald Trump was addressing delegates in Davos, everybody on the edge of their seats. Really the only question they had was what he was going to do about Greenland, how far he was prepared to go. He'd said the previous evening in the White House, "You will see." It all sounded deeply ominous. And in that speech, what was interesting for the Greenlanders is that he seemed to walk back from his threat of taking Greenland by force. He said he didn't need to do that, but he made absolutely clear his intention to own Greenland outright, right and title. He said that was the only way that world security could be ensured. He sat down with Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, with whom he's known to have a good relationship, and it was announced, apparently out of nowhere, that there was this framework deal that essentially the crisis had been diffused. NATO was going to take over security and meet the US demands and needs in terms of its concerns about Russian and Chinese activity in the Arctic around Greenland, and that's really all there was to it. No detail attached to the framework deal. And Mark Rutte, I'll just add, saying simply that they didn't discuss sovereignty. So one thing we do know is that Donald Trump hasn't got out of this deal anything that meets what he suggested was his minimum requirement, which was the ownership of Greenland.
So I do want to drill down on two major components here. There's security and then there's natural resources, and specifically talking about rare earth minerals. And we'll start with security because from the start, really, security has been this main driver for Trump.
I want Greenland for security. I don't want it for anything else. We have so much rare earth, we don't know what to do with it.
From your reporting in Greenland, can you give us a sense of the frustration or maybe bewilderment there? Because from their perspective as a NATO ally, hasn't Trump had Greenland for security this entire time?
The Greenlanders, you mean? Well, the Greenland and Denmark. Yes, of course there's frustration. Of course there's bemusement, I think, about all of this. There's a treaty that was signed in 1951 between the US and Denmark, not long after World War II, when the Americans were involved in the defense of Greenland. Donald Trump talked about that in his Davos speech. They reached this defense deal. Of course, it's hugely strategically located, this enormous island in the Arctic between the US and, if you like, Russia and China. So the US has a legitimate interest in securing Greenland. But as you say, it has always had this deal in place. It has a base at Pituffik here in Greenland. It's had that for a very long time. It has, arguably under this deal, the right to expand its presence here to an almost unlimited degree. It is a very open deal. Denmark is a NATO member, of course, so, Denmark has the ability to call on NATO's resources to further enhance security here. It was always a bit of a mystery as to what quite he was so worried about. And Donald Trump likes to paint this sort of apocalyptic idea of Russian and Chinese missiles whizzing overhead Greenland, ships and submarines in the waters off it. There's very little evidence to substantiate any of that, but that is his position and the threat that he believes only the US, no other country and no other group of countries, indeed, he said to NATO, is in a position to defend.
Yeah. And then we have the minerals. Greenland is often ranked, I think, around 8th in the world for rare earth reserves. But the problem is that they are very hard to get at. And actually, Donald Trump knows that. He's mentioned that in speeches.
There's so much rare earth, and to get to this rare earth, you got to go through hundreds of feet of ice.
Can you expand on that for us? What minerals are we talking about? Where are they? And maybe how those challenges might inform the contours of a deal that's being negotiated.
It's very hard to answer all of that. Yes, the mineral deposits are there. They've spent years and years and years, lots and lots of companies and countries, indeed, examining, looking at the presence of these minerals. They know they're there. We're not just talking about rare earth minerals. Yes, there are deep deposits of those. They believe they're very important for tech development, the defense industries, and so on. They're also talking about critical minerals, so-called, a collection of minerals used in green energy technologies. You're talking about things like batteries for electric vehicles, windmills that Trump, we know, loves so much, solar panels, and so on.
Yeah.
And there's also a bunch of other more conventional things, iron ore, nickel, lead, zinc, that kind of thing. So there's huge mineral wealth. There's also oil and natural gas. None of it, almost none of it, is tapped at present. The scientists say for every 100 deposits you find, you might get one that is actually accessible. It would take years to develop even that one. You're talking about an island with no infrastructure, really, that would accommodate that kind of exploration. So it's a huge, huge ask to suggest that there is actual, verifiable, quantifiable money value minerals here that the United States can simply step in and extract. That's a long, long way away.
Before we get into the reaction in Greenland where you are, I did want to ask you about Europe really quick. The word I keep seeing in headlines is flummoxed. That's the reaction from these leaders, which I guess is understandable considering the roller coaster that we've been on. But I guess beyond that, I think there's a palpable sense of relief. Europe seemed to be preparing for at least the possibility of losing NATO and its number one economic ally in one go. So I wonder what has stood out to you about the reaction from European leaders. I mean, and maybe how damaged this relationship is at the moment.
I think it must be profoundly damaged, quite possibly irretrievably damaged. I think the message, the penny, if you like, has finally dropped in Europe and among NATO ally nations that the US is simply not any longer and possibly will never be under Trump and Trump's successors a reliable ally, even a reliable trade partner, and that it is finally time, and many people say they've been too slow in waking up to this, but finally time for Europe to realize that it's got to stand on its own 2 feet entirely, not just in defense terms, without the constant kind of resort to America as the superpower, backing them up as they have done indeed since the end of World War II. So there's a recognition, it seems now, in the immediate wake of what is happening, not just in Venezuela, but Venezuela as a backdrop to what could have happened here in Greenland. The international security architecture and international relations generally are profoundly, profoundly changed. And I think Europe has woken up to that.
Yeah. I mean, you can read into the fact that despite Trump said that he would not impose these planned tariffs on 6 EU members. These were, big tariffs. EU leaders still went ahead with this emergency summit that they have scheduled for Thursday. So what do you read into that?
Well, I suspect that's where the word flummoxed comes in. They've still got to try and figure out what actually has happened here,
right,
and what actually lies ahead. There would, arguably, against this idea that the Europeans have finally woken up, there is profit to be had in actually talking about the mechanisms that they have in place to deal with this sort of threat should it arise in the future. I mean, Donald Trump, it wouldn't be the first time that he's set maximalist demands, walked them back. Trump always chickens out that Monica taco that he's got, but then ramps it up again when it suits him. So I don't think anybody's going to be sitting there complacent thinking this is all over. European leaders in that emergency session, they won't be talking any longer about applying tariffs on the US as they had been discussing the possibility of, but they'll be talking about what happens next time with this anti-coercion mechanism, so-called, that they've got, which was designed to counter Chinese coercion, but might very well in the future have to be deployed against the United States. Essentially what that means is giving them the power to block access for US companies to the huge EU market. That means tech companies, that means aircraft manufacturers, agricultural products, all sorts of things. It's not just about tariffs, it's about actually locking the US potentially out of the European market or the EU market altogether. A huge, huge device, a nuclear option, if you like, but one they have been now contemplating using. And I think they're going to have to talk about the possibility of contemplating it in the future.
We'll have more with Jonah after this break. So, Jonah, let's talk about where you are, Greenland. I actually had the pleasure of talking to Sara Olsvik, who's the international chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, the ICC. And she spoke really passionately about Greenland's legacy of colonization and its longstanding independence movement. And I wonder how people there are taking this. I know it's still early days, but especially when the colonization rhetoric seems to be only expanding, right? I mean, it's overt here. We're talking about gaining priority access to minerals in their home.
Sure. I mean, they have, as you say, a long background in the idea of colonization. Yes, of course, there is talk. As I understand it, there are factions that talk about, wanting greater autonomy from Denmark. There are factions that talk about independence from Denmark. That is part of the sort of political conversation here. And indeed, they have the right, should they wish, to call a referendum. And if they decide to actually separate from Denmark, that is within their gift.
Yeah, that's important.
It is important. It's important to understand that. It's important to understand why they don't do that as well as a majority, and that is because they benefit from, a lot of money that comes in from Denmark. They benefit from this sort of Scandinavian model of free public services, free healthcare, free education, and so on. And that's a lot to give up when you haven't actually got, whilst you've got all this stuff buried under the ice, you haven't actually got very much else going on in terms of an economy outside fisheries and so on. That can sustain you. But yeah, the spectre of American colonization loomed large for a while. They know perfectly well, I am told, what happens to or has happened to Inuit communities in Alaska. They know what happens in terms of healthcare in the United States. They're not in a hurry. They simply are not in a hurry to embrace the overlord US. The last time they were asked, the Greenlanders, 85% of them flatly said no. Only 6% would even contemplate the prospect.
So it seems like we've avoided the proverbial tanks rolling into the Capitol and taking over the parliament phase. But under this framework, the U.S. would control parts of Greenland by designating them as sovereign bases. I think this is something similar to what the U.K. has in Cyprus, right? So how big of a change would that actually be? What is the current state of U.S. military presence in Greenland already?
As I understand it, the one base, Pituffik, they've got, J.D. Vance visited it, if you remember, about a year ago. I've seen diplomats quoted, basically, suggesting that under the terms of this framework deal, the US would be granted the rights to open unlimited numbers of US bases and be given the ownership of the soil beneath them, sovereignty of the soil underneath them, as you say, similar to UK bases in Cyprus. And the idea would be that this gives them the opportunity to build, and with ownership certainty. Donald Trump wants right and title. He doesn't want to be defending a lease, he said to Davos, to build this Golden Dome project. The Golden Dome, similar but much bigger in scale to Israel's Iron Dome, that would protect North America, including Canada, from the threat of, as I said, Russian and Chinese missiles whizzing overhead. He wants to be able to put those missile defense structures here in Greenland, and he wants to be able to own the ground underneath them. That seems to be what is suggested here, but we haven't seen that with any certainty.
Are people taking this Golden Dome thing seriously outside of basically this White House?
Generally in the world, or here in Greenland, do you mean? I mean,
maybe both. I don't know. It's just a general question.
I mean, it strikes me that issues like that are not the sorts of things that people in Greenland have concerned themselves with. They have been terrified. Frankly, there is a real sense of palpable fear here about the possibility, particularly having seen what happened in Venezuela, U.S. Marines landing on the beaches of Greenland. Is the rest of the world taking it seriously? I mean, you wouldn't want to rule it out, would you? I mean,
no, it's a tough question to ask. Yeah, tough question to ask. Yeah. The people of Greenland have now found themselves at the center of this international crisis. Now they're in the middle of this solution to that international crisis. But what's wild is that it's all being hammered out thousands of miles away. I mean, it's really remarkable when you think about it. The President of the United States, the Secretary General of NATO, get into a room together in Switzerland, Davos, no doubt, and they chart this path for Greenland's future. From what you've learned about the character of these people, do you think that the Americans and the Europeans might be underestimating them, that they will have a say in their future one way or the other?
Well, look, they've demanded a say in negotiations ongoing, and as I understand it, the Danes certainly have agreed that Greenland must be at the table. And one has to assume that will be the case. Again, I would come back to the idea that this framework deal, as it stands, what little we know of it, does not, we are assured by the Secretary General of NATO, have anything to do with Greenlandic or Danish sovereignty. They haven't discussed the issue of sovereignty, which raises in itself the question, just how secure is this deal that comes after Donald Trump stands in a crowded hall at Davos saying, I will accept nothing less than full ownership. Suddenly he's got a deal that he is willing to accept. Somebody's not telling the full truth here, and my instinct would be to listen to Mark Rutte's words with care. Sovereignty not discussed, mineral access not discussed. All we're talking about here is a security deal. I would suggest that suggests there could well be more to come in discussions and negotiations going forward, which the Danes say the Greenlanders will be involved in.
Yeah. What do you make of the optics of this all happening at Davos, with these kind of world elites getting together?
I mean, Davos, the so-called global elite, Donald Trump loves nothing more than to see the global elite, the CEOs of the world and the world's leaders bowed at his feet. And that happened during his first term. I was there at Davos once when Donald Trump arrived. I mean, you could feel radiating off him this sense of deep pleasure and satisfaction at seeing all of these people. Fellow captains of industry, of course, when he was a businessman in New York, now, bowing at his feet. It is that sort of forum for Donald Trump. He walked in there yesterday. He knew he had the world on edge. If you remember the way he introduced Greenland in his speech, he said, would you like me to say something about Greenland now? I was going to leave it out, but hey, this is.
It's all a performance.
Well, it's a performance, but it's also the ultimate exertion, the ultimate display of power for him.
What do you feel like people don't understand about Greenland? But now that you've been there, now that you've sort of soaked it up, what do you think people are getting wrong about this story, or what is something you could share about your experience there?
What has struck me is the pride of a people, an indigenous people who have a very defined and distinct culture, a culture that has only in fairly limited ways let in the outside world. They are very proud of that. They're very proud of the hardships that they endure and the lifestyles that they lead, that they have been here for 1,000 years, that they have done so uninterrupted, that they have done so without access to modern technology. Of course, this is a modern place now, particularly the capital, Nuuk. But I think, Donald Trump, again, to bring him into it, how could one not? Again, in that speech to Davos, talked about this piece of ice, a giant piece of ice, vast, cold. He said it was poorly located, and he said it was almost uninhabited. This is the idea, I think, that a lot of people probably have of a place like Greenland. It has struck me being here, and I've enjoyed very much being introduced to, a very, very distinct and proud culture. And I think that is possibly my biggest reckoning at the moment.
Okay. Well, why don't we leave it there? Jonah, thank you for coming on The Take.
Pleasure. Thank you.